I'd like to thank you all for coming to the Effective Teaching Workshop. This is the last in the series. We've had spectacular presenters, spectacular information, and I just wanted to tell you that your certificates of completion, if you've attended all of them for obviously a certain amount of time, each time that you came into a workshop, then those will be sent out at some time next week. And if you are doing the micro-credential work, we're still working on that, and that will be sent out probably mid-March once everything's completed. And now I'm going to turn it over to our spectacular presenters. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. And this is bittersweet because it's our fifth and last session together. We're joined today by Dr. Cavalieri. He is one of our third year and graduating internal medicine residents. He's in our resident as educators pathway and has a dedicated interest in education. So we'll let him pull up the slides and share his screen, and we'll get started. So today we're going to be talking about feedback and evaluation, fostering learner development, and self-regulated learning. We hope that by the end of our time together, you're able to summarize approaches for providing effective feedback when working with learners in a variety of settings. We're also going to have you evaluate a sample written comment as a framework for analysis, to practice applying some coaching strategies for working with challenging or struggling learners, and then to develop a personal plan for providing feedback while reflecting on the TPI. So Christian, why don't you get us started?
All right, hi guys. Again, my name is Dr. Christian Cavalieri, one of the internal medicine residents, and I'm here to talk to you guys a little bit about the first part of this presentation about feedback. As a resident, I work with med students and I work with junior residents, so I'm giving feedback pretty often, and I'm sure we've all done this in one way or another. So what's important? Why do we even care about feedback? Why is it so important? Well, skills are integration of our cognitive, affective, and skill behaviors. And it's more easily demonstrated and learned with practice, feedback, and more practice. How can we prove we don't know we're doing well when we're not doing well? Without feedback, if you make a mistake, it goes uncorrected. Good performance is not reinforced, and clinical competence is achieved empirically or not at all. If you do feedback well and give good feedback, it promotes some reflection, and that's essential for development of expertise and lifelong learning. Okay, so obviously feedback is not all sunshines and rainbows. It's difficult. It's the reason why it doesn't always happen perfectly. So what are some barriers? First of all, it's time consuming. We got to set aside time to do this feedback. And I struggle with this a lot, giving negative feedback to people. It's like when they're doing something wrong, it's very hard to call out that behavior. And there's always the fear of retribution. It's very easy for someone who's senior to give feedback to a junior, but vice versa, there could be fear that giving that feedback might lead to consequences. And also that belief that feedback just doesn't work.
I think to add a little bit more to that, Christian, would be, fear of retribution isn't just when you're giving the feedback upwards, right? So it isn't just when a junior learner is giving that feedback to an attending. I think it can also happen downward. So I know that a lot of our teaching attendings, their evaluations and how they perform in terms of their roles as educators is something that's used for promotional purposes. It's something that's used for extra time or more time on the teaching services. And I think that being fearful of giving too much negative feedback or constructive feedback can be viewed negatively by, the person who's giving that feedback because they don't want it to be to have any negative consequences for them. And I think that that's just the reality, no matter whether the feedback is being given upward or downward. And we're going to talk today about some strategies that could help support you when doing this.
I'll also chime in to just say that when we started out our series together and we were looking at the teaching perspectives inventory, one of the challenges that our nurturing perspective, so individuals who had that as their more dominant perspective, oftentimes can struggle with giving that more critical feedback or constructive feedback simply because of their concerns related, not simply, but because of the concerns related to not wanting to have a possible negative impact on that relationship there. And that was one of the things that we spent a little bit of time on if you were with us during that session as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. When I did the teaching perspectives, I also was nurturing, and I kind of figured out that I'm also have trouble getting the negative feedback for that reason. So going back to this Miller's prism of clinical competence is very important for giving feedback, because we got to know what behaviors and how we observe those behaviors based on your expectation. Is it that they know how to do something, show, or are they actually doing it? And that's how you can observe that behavior. So just want to throw this in as a reminder. Okay, so we're trying to give, so teacher wants to give the learner information about their performance. And what we have to remember when we give feedback, it's got to be distinct in that from evaluation. Evaluation is something summative. It's passing judgment compared to peers. Feedback should not have that sort of judgment, right? We're presenting people with information on how to improve their performance, not compared to anyone else, but for their own self-interest. So there's a couple different types of feedback, of course. There's formative feedback, which is more what we're talking about here. This is ongoing feedback. This is somebody does something at the beginning in our case, a clerkship, or maybe it's the first day in the lab, and you notice a behavior, and on a Tuesday, you're like, hey, I noticed that you rush a little bit. Maybe we should slow it down. You can give that any time during the week. Maybe you're pressed from time and it's not as easy for you. So you might want to do this midpoint where at the end of week 1, you're commenting on the same behavior. But again, it's meant to have immediate changes. You notice someone's rushing, you tell them to take their time, and you keep following up on that. And then you can also obviously comment on other behaviors. Summative is a little different. So this would be something at the end of a learning experience. So say you've been working with a learner for a month, a week, 3 months, all depends on what your kind of scenario is. But this is at the end of the clinical experience or educational experience, right? This is more like what we think of like written evaluations, higher stakes, and usually it's more generalizable. It's like, how did you do today, and how could you improve for your next experience? More than you're in this experience, how do we improve right now so you do what better in our current experience? Okay, so now we want to break into breakout rooms here, reflecting on those TPI results like Dr. Meka mentioned with the nurturing. We want you to think about some good and bad experiences you guys had with feedback. And then who provided the useful feedback? What were they doing?
So as you go into the breakout rooms, what we'll ask you to do is potentially, if you remember what your most dominant perspective was, as well as perhaps what your backups might be, how you think that may have an impact or an influence on how you give feedback, and some examples of what has gone well for you, or potentially experiences that you might have had as a receiver of feedback as well.
You can also reflect on the cultural responsiveness that we talked about last time, and we introduced some core tenets of giving feedback within that session. So maybe it's examples of how you've seen feedback be really culturally responsive. That's another talking point that you could potentially reflect and share.
So I'm going to launch the rooms now.
All right, guys, welcome back. Welcome back. I know I personally have a ton of good and bad examples in my brain, so I'm excited to see what you guys came up with. And I want to share what you guys were talking about.
Feel free to also include it in the chat or unmute your mic.
Mm-hmm.
Hello. This is Kian. So yeah, in our group chat, we were really defining the fundamentals or the foundation to produce feedback. And I think one of the big topics was generating trust. Every relationship requires trust, and that also incorporates the aspects of vulnerability to be a huge player in providing feedback. So regardless if it's above or below, the trust being developed is crucial, and also separating out the identity of the person providing the feedback versus the feedback in general is associated more so with the opportunity to grow versus the adversity of not assimilating to a definitive course of action or activity, I guess.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Keen. Absolutely. Vulnerability and trust. If you don't trust the person giving feedback, you're not going to feel like you can give good feedback or be honest what's going on. Did you guys have like a specific example that you guys remember in your group or anything like that of when this happened, or just kind of just general?
We did. I can't recall who voiced nursing program or nurses. It was a really good example, but just in general, I guess we're just understanding fundamentals.
Yeah, that's fine. That's awesome. Thank you, Kian. I appreciate it. Thanks for sharing. I see someone put a chat in. Okay. Anyone else have any other examples, good or bad, or some kind of fundamentals, maybe think about your TPI?
Yeah, we were discussing a little bit of how to translate our TPI results sort of into something actionable, and comparing like the subscales to the main scores a little bit, especially comparing in, I think, was it beliefs and actions, a little bit, and seeing where some of the disparities might be.
And did you notice anyone within your group that you had greater disparities either between those beliefs and intentions and actions for specifically specific types of behaviors, like perhaps giving feedback versus, assessing learners or creating a lesson or a curriculum or overall program design or instructional activities?
The conversation was focused more on sort of our perceptions of what we were doing and what we were trying to do, and then what the TPI sort of revealed. For example, we discussed, understanding a personal style of like high transmission, but then trying to adjust that to be more of a like either an apprenticeship or developmental model, and thinking that it was maybe somewhat successful, and then seeing that the TPI results suggested that might not be the case.
Oh, interesting. Okay. And I think, one of the things that Dan talks a lot about that we had mentioned during that session is it's not to really think that you should strive to be a certain way, but, having an understanding of your dominant perspective and what some of those challenges and weaknesses might be. So if you are transmissive, and that tends to be your perspective, then I could see where potentially it might be a little bit outside of your comfort zone to maybe be having more of a dialogue or a conversation as it relates to feedback and potentially setting, some opportunities for growth and what that type of like co-creation of a plan together might look like. Whereas if I see someone who's potentially apprenticeship, I think that might look a little bit different. So I would almost actually, as you bring that up, I really appreciate that that's what your group was talking about, because I wonder about what a feedback conversation might look like in each of those different perspectives, and what it might look like to be trying to, like you were saying, do some better alignment there, because I could see where, again, I know where we have some of our challenges, but, what are some of the strengths that we can draw upon as well that might actually help all of us become better at giving feedback.
I actually have one. Can I share?
Please. Absolutely.
Now, mine is dealing with workshops, so it's much different than a life and death situation. So that's going to make a difference here. I find that good things happen when you give a few warm comments first, things that the presenter has done incredibly well, and then you can start integrating in those cool comments or areas of not necessarily struggle, but things that could change. So I find that when you do that, people are more receptive to it because they did and were able to hear something that they did incredibly well. And then they're able to, especially how you word it, have you ever tried? This is a suggestion. How about next time? And just the way you have those specific cool comments, and we actually use sentence stems even with some of our adults so they can learn how to give proper cool comments and constructive feedback. And I find it's very helpful. There was one student I had who just wanted the cool comments, and I could see her deflate when I gave her a cool comment first. And so I immediately switched back to warm comments, and it really built her up. So I've never really given cool comments first with anyone except for colleagues that I know truly want those cool comments over warm comments first. So it's really important to build them up because there's got to be almost in every situation something they're doing well. And so talk about that and then start integrating those cool and warm comments back in first. After, of course, asking them how they think they've done first. Thank you.
All really wonderful points. And Catherine, one of the other things that I love about what you just said as well is the fact that this specificity, right? Because I think that in addition to starting with the warm and, a positive thing, but a very specific thing, not saying, I think you did a great job. I thought the presentation was wonderful. You give up something very specific, and then it shows that you care, right? It shows that you're noticing, you're paying attention to, and able to give something very specific. And not that using, a broader one doesn't indicate that, but I feel like it opens the door to that conversation a little bit more, at least in my experience as well.
It does, and I find that very few people shut down when they realize that they've done something well.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Okay, so I think we got some good comments reflecting on our TPI, talked a little about some examples that we think is like good to have in feedback, be generous with positive comments, set up a good learning environment, be specific. And what do you know? These are some of the things we're actually going to talk about in the next few slides. It's like you guys read my mind. Okay, so we'll talk a little about giving effective feedback. So the first thing is we don't want to overwhelm people. Kind of like Catherine was saying, like if you give a lot of negative comments, people are going to shut down really quickly. Or even if you're just like firing off one positive, one positive. Remember, we're humans. We like things to be simple and in short, easily digestible bites. So I usually go by that rule of try not to say more than 3 things at once or give 3 suggestions because people will shut down. So don't give them too much information. And avoid commenting about the person, right? We're trying to comment about specific behaviors that we can fix. We're not commenting about the person. I mean, there are some issues we might have to comment on if there's some serious professional or attitude problems, but you can't really change a person's personality and you don't want to make them feel bad. You want them to continue to work towards improving their behavior. So we try and avoid comments with the person. And again, like we said now a few times, describe performance behaviors, and you want to try and use objective language. You want to say, this is what I observed, and this is how I feel like should be improved. So we want to say something very specific.
Just because I think that's really key. Using terms like I saw, you did, I read, maybe you're reading a report or something that they had written, and so that they understand that it's firsthand knowledge that you are trying to give them feedback about, not things that you may have heard, 3 times removed. Of course, if you're a higher level supervisor, that might be the case. You might have heard things from other people, but in those contexts, it's important to describe specifically from who and in what context you heard things. But whenever possible, basing your feedback on your direct observation and on the actual behaviors.
Absolutely. And the next thing would be to provide opportunities for learners to reflect. So this is kind of like a shift in perspective. We're not just trying to give up free advice. The best way to get someone to actually do something is come up with it themselves. So if they can reflect on that behavior, that is the best way for them to actually be more motivated to actually enact change. And then again, this is the next thing too. I know this has been very difficult for me is to use specific and neutral language. Not you did bad, not you did good. This is what you do. This is what I observed, and this is what I expect from you too. Or this is so I guess a good example of this is again, I go back to that lab tech, the efficiency thing, right? You're being, she's being too quick with her work, causing her to make mistakes, right? If I use neutral language or if I start using like you did bad, you're moving too fast, it's, I observed that you've been rushing a little bit. I really would think this should take a little longer. And I think it's very easy that you should be able to take your time. Trying to say they did good, they did bad, just I observed this, and this is how we can improve behavior. So where to start? Obviously, before you can give feedback or like think about this, what are your expectations for your learner? This is one of the mnemonics you can use. It's called baskets. But overall, just what do you expect of your learner and try and make those expectations well known to them. If they don't know their expectations, if you don't know their expectations, how can you give any feedback, right? So what behaviors do you want to foster? Are you a nursing student? Is it patient rapport? Is it vital signs? What is it, right? What attitudes? Do you want to be professional, kind, friendly, and skills? Are you in the OR? Do you need to do suturing? Do you again need to take vitals? You need to learn how to listen to lungs. You need to learn how to do a Western blot. What do you actually want them to learn? And what new knowledge should be learned? What are you trying to teach them? And then technology can be very important, right? Especially in all our fields. EMRs, there's like 5 bajillion ones in Buffalo. Is this a new EMR they have to learn? Are you using Excel? Are you using a different software? what are you using? And then how will the learning be sustained, right? Is this something they're supposed to know? How are we going to test them and make them well aware of that?
I think this is really critical point, Christian, is setting those expectations, like you said. And, if you're trying to give feedback at the end of a time working with that learner, but that learner did not know what was expected of them on day one, it's going to be very difficult for you to provide meaningful feedback. The other thing to consider would be, what standards is the learner being held to or compared to? Do you have information from their course syllabus? Or if it's somebody in the clinical realm, nursing, medicine, dentistry, what are the clinical expectations for them? Or if they're new in your lab, what do you hope that they're going to accomplish by the end of week 1, 2, 3, 4, month 1, month 2? And so there's a lot of different models out there for setting expectations. There are some that are clinically rooted. There are some like baskets that can be used across different schools, but it's really critical that your expectations are set not just for the learning experience, but for the feedback as well when it comes to that point. So when are you going to be giving feedback? And to start to think about those sorts of things when you're setting your overall expectations.
And I think that these can also extend to other situations for many of us, for those who might have individuals who are working as part of our program or within our offices, as well as sometimes you can use some of this approach with family members or people who are taking care of or helping out with things in your personal lives as well. But I think that what you were saying in terms of not just identifying what those expectations are, but how will you be communicating and how often will you be wanting to have some of those discussions around how things are going? And oftentimes we have that ramp up period, whether that's through working with staff members or other team members or learners early on, when you do that quite regularly and are in a bit of a routine. But sometimes as that time continues, and you don't need to necessarily have that as frequently, that can sometimes be not included as regularly. So continue to figure out what is that cadence or pace going to look like, and what's going to be most beneficial for all involved.
Absolutely. Clear expectations, very important. Okay. All right. So we already kind of mentioned this. So you really got to establish a respectful learning environment. Some of you are probably wondering, well, Christian, what is a respectful learning environment? How do I do that? I think I'm respectful, everyone. Well, it's establishing this partnership, right? It's not just superior and learner. It's the idea of what I do like day one when I'm working with my interns or med students right away. I tell them, look, there's things you do know, things you don't know, and this is what I usually do, but if things don't work for you, we can work together. And on day one, I'm kind of starting a dialogue. I'm not just telling them exactly what they need. I'm trying to work with them based on their specific needs. Remember, a learner, in our case, like a first-year med student, there's first-year med students that are ahead, who are behind, all these things. And like even people within that setting too, there might be some skills they're better at. And being able to like know that right off the bat is very important. And we talked about the trust too. If you don't trust your supervisor, you think they're just going to fail you or not going to help you, then that's not going to be very helpful at all. And again, the learner self-assessment is helpful too. You're setting those expectations. Then you can ask the learner, where do you fall within these expectations? Where do you have to work with? What do you specifically want out of this experience? I think that becomes very helpful.
I think too, in starting with the self-assessment, this allows you to guide the feedback that you're about to give. The majority of the time, I would say for me, the learner is pretty accurate. They know how they performed. They're giving a pretty accurate assessment of their overall performance. Now, of course, there is that minority of times when that is not the case, and the learner doesn't have an appropriate level of insight into how that they've been doing. And for you, then maybe you were going to share, 3 things with the learner that you wanted them to do better. Maybe it becomes more about one thing, or maybe it becomes the most critical thing. So starting with the self-assessment allows you as the educator to gauge and tailor the feedback that you're going to give them in the conversation that follows.
Okay. And then, with this, how are we, what is the learner? What are their ideas? It's setting clear goals and objectives, right? They know what their skill level is and they know what they want to improve on most of the time. Obviously, Dr. K was mentioning sometimes that's not the case. We have to guide them a little bit more into what they should be expecting. But clear objectives, right? Not that you're going to get good at lab work this week. No, you're going to be able to do a Western blot from start to finish. You're going to get your vitals done and you're able to do it for all the patients on the floor. So clear expectations, learner self-assessment. What do they want? And then based on what they want, but what do you also expect as their supervisor too? And then we already talked about this, the direct observation. It's very vital that the observation is direct, right? I think anytime anyone's had an argument with someone, they're like, hey, give me an example of that. We want examples of when things happen. So we know, so we have a clear picture in mind. Oh, this is what I should change and when I should change it. So on those specific behaviors, such as, let me see, a nursing student, I observed you doing your vital signs and I saw that you're able to do the vitals from completion. You directly observe that they did their vitals, or at the end of the week, you're like, yeah, I heard you were able to do the vitals, but you never really observed it. One has a lot more power and more appropriate feedback. Also, with the direct observation, be generous with positive feedback, right? You can say 9 things that are good, but our brain's going to concentrate on that one bad thing, right? We're all people who are very anxious, we're high achieving, we chose one of these professions for a reason, right? So we really need to, put a hand holding, but be very generous with the positive feedback. And then when you do have constructive feedback, don't ignore it. But when you do, you have to be a little more cautious and careful how you approach it, right? You want to use that neutral language. You want to be very specific about the behavior, and you want to be constructive.
Can I add something?
Absolutely.
Be very careful with mixing warm and cool feedback, positive and struggles. Because if you start out with saying, I really like how you did this, but people are going to remember the buts. They're not going to remember the warm feedback. So if possible, separate them. So when I give warm and cool feedback, when I'm doing my micro-credentials, for instance, I usually put the warm comment and then a cool comment, but I don't put them together because I want them to understand that there's something they did really well, and then there's something that probably does need to change. So be careful with mixing them. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, there's definitely times where, and also throughout the week, right? On Tuesday, you might not talk about the cooler comments, but on Thursday, you think maybe it's time, maybe it's a better day, you've established more rapport, so it's easier to talk about it too at that point.
Yeah, just not in the same sentence. Like for instance, I think you did a great job on this Western blot, but I saw. So, I think you did a great job in the Western blot because, and then separate it in the same day, but it's perfectly fine. Just don't put it in with the same sentence. That's all I'm saying. Sorry.
I see what you mean. Here's one goal, you met it. This other goal, you have not met it. Let's improve on it. I got you. That makes sense. And then the other thing that I think, which is super duper important, is yeah, you gave some feedback, but was it timely and regular? So I had a psychology major, so I don't know how many of you guys know about operant conditioning. Sure, you have kids or dogs or cats or something, but when you're trying to teach a behavior, say your dog pees on your sofa. If you go back and reward or punish that behavior 3 days later, it's not going to make any effect. But if you try and reward the behavior right away, then things are more likely to change. So feedback should not just occur in that feedback Friday, or maybe as soon as you see behavior, an hour later. The sooner the better, because it's still fresh in the mind, right? It should be planned to, and it should be protected. So when you're doing more of that like weekly feedback, what I like to do is take my interns, take med students, and like separate ourselves, find a different room, a private space. Again, starting that like open environment too, where they're kind of that secret safe with me kind of thing. It's a much more respectful environment to have that. And again, actionable information that can be used over the course of the experience. Feedback is something that should be helping that current situation. So you got to make sure that feedback is going to help in that experience. And then what I like to do is use those learning objectives to frame, right? So how I like to do this is we have a learning objective for our medical students. I want you to be able to present a patient in its entirety to me. So tell me everything about the patient and accurate. I not to expect them to know what's going on, but at least give me a guess. And this is their objective. At the end of the week, then I can go back and say, so here's the objective I gave you. Do you feel like you met it? Why or why not? And we can have a conversation about that. And that way, again, you're using the more neutral language in that space too. Okay, and then the last thing is to create an action plan, right? So feedback's well and dandy, but you got to help your learner to actually correct any behavior that needs to be corrected or keep encouraging them on good behavior. So this is one that we like to use in our program. It's called SMART goals, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely, a way to kind of like start creating an action plan of what to do. So thing is, when you want to tell someone something to do. You want to correct their behavior. You got to make sure they can actually do it and it's something attainable. I shouldn't expect my first day medical student to be able to have like 5 different ideas of what it is and perfectly treat a patient, right? But I can definitely expect them to talk to a patient. Maybe that's good for day one, but if it's 1 year in, I should expect them to do a little bit more than that. So try and make sure that they're attainable, measurable too. So we got to make sure we can actually talk about it. So I might want you to do vital signs on 1 patient, vital signs on 2 patients, vital signs on all the patients. Be very specific of what you want. And then, of course, you can always change it as time goes on. And then also, give them the appropriate resources too. Maybe they are struggling with the vital signs, so you have to give them a link to a video. Maybe you got to show them yourself. Do something to help give an actual plan or give them some kind of resource to help them actually accomplish that. And this is kind of what we use for our students who are in remediation too. We kind of use SMART and we create an action plan to kind of help people work through difficulties. So it kind of goes through the incident, what objectives you have to improve on that deficiency, strategies, resource, how are we going to assess it, and then what are the right criteria for the assessment, and how long do we think it's going to take. So this is not applicable to everyone, but this is what we usually use in our program.
And this is something to keep in mind, and we're going to talk in a couple of slides about working with struggling learners or learners that have a deficit or a larger area for improvement. And it's really important with them that they are involved in their learning plan creation, and the use of SMART goals or a SMART goal template or action plan is something that we know our struggling learners really benefit from, but all learners benefit from it too. So if it's something that you have the bandwidth to include in your course or your rotation or in whatever setting you're teaching, if you're teaching in a longitudinal basis, then this could be a nice thing to include as you set your expectations on day one, asking those learners, can you create a SMART goal for yourself? Can you set an expectation for yourself that then you can reflect on, draw back in when you're giving them feedback? Or if it's a feedback session, you're ending your time with them, is there something that they can create for themselves moving forward to address some of the issues that you may have brought up?
Okay, and the last thing, I just want to briefly mention this. This is something I learned about recently, but when you're done with your feedback, you can actually ask for feedback on your feedback, because sometimes you don't know, maybe there's a way of giving feedback that the learner really doesn't work well for them, or maybe there's something you did very well, and you're never going to improve on your feedback skills if you don't ask for people, hey, how was that feedback? Did it help? So just something to think about when you're going through this to help improve your own skills too.
Just one of the things I'll just mention with that is sometimes clearly saying that at the beginning of the session or at the beginning of that conversation, just so that people are knowing that you are open to that and they can be thinking about it and processing things from that perspective. But then also, depending on how that conversation went and where the person is and what your relationship is like, they might not be ready to do that right at the end of that session. They might need a little bit of some time, space, and maybe, to revisit that conversation later on. So that's something to be mindful as well.
Very true. This is something that I routinely do when I'm giving feedback with learners in the clinical setting, is asking for feedback, not on my feedback, but on my performance as an educator. So were there, in my role as elective director, were there things that they would have wanted to be done differently during the course of their whole rotation? Are there things that they would like for me to do differently when I'm working with learners or when I'm clinically precepting? And I've found that honestly, the learners are really truthful. And I've taken things that they have said to me and I've incorporated them into the elective and into my own personal practice as time has gone on as a result. It also helps to establish that two-way conversation that Christian showed during the first principle, that mutual trust and respect, that you're listening to them, listening to the feedback that they're giving you, and you're going to take and incorporate that moving forward.
And I think it allows for conversations to go beyond what you might get from your typical, course or workshop or session or evaluation. That, again, there are going to always be some of those questions that might ask for things that you can improve upon and things that you did well and things that might be specific to the course itself. But as the educator and someone who had recently gone there might be some additional things that you could probe that will be really helpful to help improve not only your work as an educator, but also the overall program too.
Absolutely. Feedback all around always improves. Okay, so I have this example I was trying to find something that was pretty neutral because I know everyone's from a slightly different profession here. So I came up with this example of Jim the plumber. Okay, so Jim, he's at the end of his first week of work at a local hardware store, Home Depot, Lowe's, Ace, whatever you guys like to go to. At the beginning of the week, he had an orientation with his boss. His boss would actually discuss job expectations with him, and he let him know that he was going to have performance reviews once per week for his first month. His expectations were to be prompt, kind, and professional, and work well with his coworkers. He's an expert in plumbing, so he should know about all the tools in his plumbing aisle and have some kind of understanding of where other products are to help customers. So it's the end of his week, and to start kind of this first feedback session, Jim's boss asked him how he thought the week went. So Jim agrees that he was always on time and did his best to be kind to all. He reports that he had some trouble working with coworkers in other departments, though, as his knowledge of other products' precise location was difficult. His coworkers weren't so willing to help him, unfortunately. He feels very comfortable with his plumbing knowledge as he was previously a plumber, but wants to work on other product knowledge. So in response, Jim's boss agrees he was prompt and professional. His knowledge of plumbing is outstanding and will take time to learn product placement in the store. He hands him a guide he used when first working at the store to use as a cheat sheet. Jim's boss also agrees that teamwork could be improved on in the store, and he's actually been looking into some teamwork exercises for the store. He then asked for feedback on his orientation week and how it could be improved. So if you guys feel comfortable, I know this was a lot. Try and concentrate just on this last part about what Jim's boss said, but you didn't comment about the other things. What principles were evident in this scenario about feedback? And do you think there was anything missing or that Jim's boss could have done better based on our principles?
I like that. A comment about immediate action, self-assessment, specific. I think another thing for me is validation. He acknowledges that the teamwork could be improved and was able to say some, he's looking into teamwork or team building exercises. That's validating and, can help to establish some trust. Neutral language, specific examples, outline from the outlined objectives. That's great. Room for improvement would be to further elaborate on some of the strategies that could be used for the teamwork and what specifically he should do to improve. Boss provided a resource. Yes, I think that's definitely a pro here. Part of me wonders if an area for improvement might have been providing that on day one instead of in the first feedback session, but was provided. And what are the roles for the other workers? What's the role for his boss? And how does everybody come together as a team? So some clarification. Anybody else think there was elements that were grossly missing? Another pro, feedback being actionable. Overall, a lot of great things happened in this example, as you guys have all outlined.
Maybe explore more about what other scenario and situation that he advanced in his team building skill. He must have
worked well in the past in his other experiences.
Right. He must have had something that worked in the past that you can build upon so that, encouraging him to improve.
Yeah. Dr. Meka suggesting, kind of referencing back to our SMART action plan. What is the time frame for the actions moving forward? We mentioned that specific, right? Actionable, relevant, time-bound, measurable, all the things that Christian had mentioned a couple slides ago.
And I think that's one of the things that we'll talk a little bit more when we talk about struggling learners too, is that, ensuring that there is that time frame for what is going to be the follow-up or check back in or the next time that we'll have a conversation around it. So they both identified things they were going to do or wanted to be doing, but we don't know exactly, is the boss going to look into some of those team exercises for the store that take place in the next month, year? What is that time frame there?
Right. We're going to transition a little bit now. Christian expertly went over all of the principles, but we're going to talk about some specific feedback models. And it's not that you need to necessarily memorize all of these. You'll see that there's a lot of overlap and similar theming as we go through it. From a practical standpoint, I do use one of these models. It's because or a modified version of one of these. And so I know every time I approach a feedback interaction, I'm going to do it the way that I feel the most comfortable, the way that's worked best for me in the past. So it's not necessarily that you have to pick one and follow it to the letter. It's exposing you to things that may work for you so that you can develop your own rhetoric when approaching feedback conversations. And maybe it's a different model that you would use for a learner who's excelling versus one who maybe needs a bit of hand-holding and some more guidance versus one that needs a full remediation, right? So the first one is the slate mnemonic. So, setting the stage, being timely and explicit. I am giving you feedback. This is an interesting phenomenon and something that we see quite commonly in the medical education sphere, is that our learners will be surveyed and say, I wasn't given any feedback. I didn't receive any feedback during my rotation. When we'll ask their supervising physicians the same thing, we'll say, what? I gave them feedback every day on things that they could do differently or improve on the next day. But because the teacher wasn't saying feedback, it didn't register for the learner that it was actually feedback. So I would encourage you to literally say the word when you are doing it. And then again, reviewing those goals and objectives. This is a nice one because it has the learner self-assessment built right into it. Action plan to address perceived getting gaps in knowledge, skills, or behaviors, and then allowing for the instructor to provide some input, focusing on a knowledge and observed skill or behavior, modifying that action plan that the learner specifically identified, and then engaging in that back and forth dialogue. So setting the stage, learner self-assessment, asking the learner to develop an action plan right after their self-assessment, and then having the teacher's input, and then encouraging that back and forth dialogue, hopefully resulting in an agreement on what that action plan is going to be and when is the time to follow up on that. Sharp 5, another one. You'll see a lot of mnemonics here. So this one, the S standing for set the learning objectives and goals beforehand. How did it go? Addressing any concerns that were raised by the learner, reviewing some key points. Yes, you met the objectives, or you met objective 1 and 2 and 3. You didn't meet objective 4. You were almost there. This is what we can do in terms of P, planning ahead for future actions. This is what we can do to get you there. So again, you'll see some commonality, setting objectives and goals beforehand, asking the learner for their input and their reflection on how it went, addressing concerns, reviewing the learning points as they pertain to the objectives, and then SMART goal setting or action planning for further directions, future directions. So this is the feedback sandwich that was mentioned in the chat, and that I'm sure that we're mostly all familiar with, or we've been the recipients of. And it's the old feedback sandwich. So you say something positive, then you introduce a constructive or negative feedback, and then you close with something positive to try to build that trust and comfort. The initial aim here was to minimize any detrimental effect that the negative feedback would have on the learner, and to ensure that the learner is not discouraged. But does anybody want to wager what actually happens when we follow this model?
The message is missed.
It's one of two extremes. It's either that I'm doing so well, I missed all my research publication deadlines and didn't have any product to show at the end of my 6 months in the lab, but everybody seemed to like me, and overall I heard great things. So that's one. The other is I'm so terrible, they're just saying the positive things to pushing around the negative thing, which is really the main reason, really the main feedback. So it's an interesting phenomenon, but they don't take away collective, well-rounded feedback from it. So we have a new feedback sandwich, and this is what I use when I'm giving feedback to learners. So I ask the learner for their own assessment of their performance. This begins the conversation. It's an interactive process, again, assessing the learner's level of insight. I'll also, in the ask them for feedback on my performance, as I mentioned. So old is positive, negative, positive. New is ask, tell, ask. So that's the first ask. And then into tell what you observed in an explanation. I react to their observation, what their self-reflection was. And And I include here both positive and corrective elements. The same rules apply about limiting the amount you're given. The same suggestions per Catherine about completing that positive statement before moving on into a cool or more corrective statement. But then in the end, asking about their understanding. So what could you do differently? Can you give me some of your own suggestions? Or let me provide you with my suggestions. Let's commit to something moving forward. And so ask, tell, ask. It's easy. It's intuitive, at least to me. And this is the one that I tend to use the most frequently. 360-degree, another really great model. So in this model, all team members provide feedback to one another. This is a session that's planned in advance. It promotes a culture of openness and normalizes feedback. Some schools choose to call this Feedback Fridays. Friday, it can be the end of the rotation or the end of the, week of working together. But it's a cute little, Feedback Friday. Everybody knows about it. They know the time that it's going to happen. They know the day that it's going to happen. And generally, when I do this or have done this, I've asked each learner to come prepared with one thing that every other learner has done really well and one thing that they could work on to improve for our next week together. And this includes for myself. And then everybody just shares this in open forum. And as the instructor, you're there to obviously facilitate and navigate the conversation. But this is something that our residents have responded really positively to. I've been the recipient of feedback like this, and it just helps to create that trust, that respect, and that learning environment that most of us as educators are really striving for.
This is something similar in education called the tuning protocol. We do the exact same thing with Mormon feedback.
A comment in the chat about new approaches apply emotional intelligence edge to the learning experience. And we are going to touch on that when we discuss a brief introduction to coaching and some of the coaching philosophies that you can introduce when providing feedback, which relies heavily on the development of emotional intelligence in our learners. So more to come in a couple of slides about that. Thank you for the suggestion. Okay. So we have a case, and we're going to put you in your breakout rooms to talk about this. So it can, and when we do, you can think about any of the principles Christian reviewed, any of the models I use, bits and pieces of each. So Jen is a master's student working in a microbiome lab. She's been with the lab for the last 2 months. You are her supervisor, and you've noticed that she has shown up late 30 minutes almost every day. The lab techs she has been working with have attempted on multiple occasions to discuss her tardiness, but she's always very dismissive and has a different excuse every day. Additionally, you also note that she frequently misses deadlines and that some of her work is incomplete with a lack of attention to detail. So there's a few things here. She's been with you 2 months. You're her direct supervisor. She's continuously late. It's tried to be addressed by colleagues and peers. She seems to be dismissive. In terms of other things, she's missed some deadlines and her work is lacking with attention to detail. This is a hard one and one of the more challenging ones that we as educators learn to navigate, but we will have you discuss this and maybe think about who could potentially be a spokesperson for your group when we come back together. Okay, everybody, welcome back. Would anybody like to volunteer in the chat or unmute your mic and share one principle you would follow or one thing that you would do with this learner?
Sure, why not? So we were talking about content versus process, like technique versus the nuances of like connection and context and relationship, right? Because I'm clinical psychology, so that's where I go. And we sort of the approach, right? You could ask, tell, ask, and you could say, "What's going on? You're late every day. Why are you doing that?" Right? Ask, tell, ask. But that's not quite going to be. It's not going to be very effective. So we were talking about the idea of sort of being charitable, being curious, trying to connect and understand the person to a certain degree, and then making sure that the boundaries were sort of firmly delineated and there's a process to follow. That if they're not able to engage willingly and do what they need to do, after all, it is a job, then there will be some consequences. So I don't know if we followed a model per se. It was just thinking about, how we might do it. So
trying to build some rapport, but also in the end, saying these are very clear what the expectations are, and we expect that you follow them. So I think, a hybrid model where you are trying to connect and use empathy, but at the end of the day, re-emphasizing what your expectations are may be effective. I mentioned in the chat about this being a good opportunity for a SMART action plan. I agree, valuable for the employee to complete after discussion with them. Ensuring the supervisor is empathetic and understanding. And also love this, providing EAP resources if needed. That's a really wonderful suggestion. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides. So thank you for that. Okay, in the interest of time, we'll move forward. Instead of having you guys discuss this, we're going to talk a little bit about the struggling learner. And so you can go to the next slide, Christian. Generally, how the struggling learner is defined is that it's one whose performance is significantly below potential because of a specific affective, cognitive, structural, or interpersonal difficulty. So it's a learner who's below standards. And when working with these type of learners, it's very important that you name the behavior. Be as concrete and specific as possible. Remember last time we talked a lot about cultural responsiveness and your own bias and your own implicit bias. And we ended towards the end of the session with the Harvard implicit bias testing that was kind of a little bit of your homework to do or explore if you were interested, but recognize that within yourself, you have biases and that may affect your reaction, and try to avoid emotional responses. And when working with learners, especially those that have deficits in the professionalism domain, that can be more of a challenge than you would think. And so naming the specific behavior when you're approaching feedback with a learner who is definitely struggling. Next slide. So forming the differential, right? Where is this problem? Is it a problem with knowledge or knowledge acquisition? Maybe it's a problem with the application of the knowledge. They have the knowledge, but they can't translate it or apply it in the right setting. Maybe it's a skills problem. Maybe it's a professionalism issue, attitudes and behaviors. Maybe there's something else going on. And so we would be remiss if we didn't mention this in this talk today, and the 6Ds or however you want to approach it. But if there's underlying depression, distraction, maybe there's something really significant going on in this person's life, right? Disability, drugs, disordered personality. If those things are present and you haven't worked to address them, no amount of feedback or action planning is going to be successful. I'm sorry, I'm turning my camera off because I'm having a little bit of a delay. Can you still hear me okay? Okay. So working with that struggling learner, being very specific about the behavior, trying to figure out what exactly is going on. And in medical education, we have milestones, we have different criteria upon which we evaluate our learners. And so that can be helpful to name the specific deficit. And those exist across schools and across the different areas in which you work. You can also check your syllabus and your rubrics for, the different areas where somebody may be behind. But screening for these things, depression, etc., is really crucial when approaching working with a struggling learner. Next slide. So considering your approach, and it could be a hybrid or any one of the approaches that you all had suggested, but you really want to make sure that you're preparing in advance for this one. So what data do you have available to you? What evidence do you have to support the feedback that you're going to give? What's your role? Again, recreating that atmosphere of safety and trust. Diagnosing what the problem is, and then creating the plan. So the similar approach that we followed, but the key here is preparing in advance for this and making sure that the time that you're going to do this is protected time in a safe space. Next slide. So remediation and coaching is based on deliberate practice, feedback and reflection, and continuous reassessment. And so any of the feedback that you're going to give to a learner, but especially a struggling learner, you're going to want them to go back and practice what you told them, right? And then how are you going to assess? How are you going to assess if they're making progress? Is it you who's going to be assessing it? Is it a dean in your school? Is it their advisor? Is it themselves? Is it all of these people? And what are their roles, right? So we don't have time today to go into remediation strategies in depth. And as it relates to feedback, being as specific specific, tying in when they're going to practice it and putting together that SMART action plan for when the follow-up is going to be. But another critical point here ties back into assessment. And we talked about this last week when we were discussing cultural responsiveness and how that pertains to our assessment modalities. Are they fair? Is there bias? And of course, we talked about this when we were discussing our backward design framework and how we're going to assess if our learning objectives have been met. So if your learner is behind as it pertains to certain objectives and you're going to give them the specific feedback, take the time for it, they're going to practice it. This is where assessment comes in, and it's really key for all learners, but especially for those that are struggling. Next slide. So process for feedback with struggling learners, setting it up, observing, delivering, and accountability and next steps. And we don't have to spend a ton of time on that. Transitioning now to motivational interviewing. So this is now, we're going to speak a bit about coaching. So I think I'll turn it over to Dr. Meka here to touch on motivational interviewing in this setting and to expand further.
Thank you very much. So, motivational interviewing, many of you have already mentioned some of bringing in a variety of different perspectives and approaches in some of your comments and throughout our discussion today. Motivational interviewing is a collaborative conversation style for strengthening a person's own motivation and their commitment to change. So getting a better understanding of where they are, focusing on that guiding rather than being directive, and to ask some open-ended questions to find out what might best help them in achieving and working towards those goals that you come up with together. Now, when we lean into more of a coaching approach, coaching is something that we've heard a lot about, and over the course of trainings, that whether that is related to sports or business or thinking about the different roles that individuals play in other types of activities that you might have been involved with. And it's something that has been used in professional areas and in business world for many, many years. And I think probably around 2010 really became a little bit more popular within health professions education. And Atul Gawande at the time had written an article that I believe was in the New Yorker, and also had a pretty famous YouTube video and speaking event that he talked about his own use of a coach, first as a young tennis player growing up and through his adolescence, and then being able to connect that into considering whether or not that would be something beneficial for him as a surgeon. And so going from there, it became something that I think became a little bit more acceptable and something that people were exploring using, and all the opportunities for application within health professions education. So an academic coach would be someone who is assigned to help facilitate learners in achieving their fullest potential, drawing on some of these, again, best practices in terms of reflection, self-actualization, and oftentimes using a variety of different types of approaches or a combination of approaches as well. So you can see that there does need to be a little bit of a distinction then, because we oftentimes within the sphere of academics have different types of roles for our faculty members or staff who are involved in working with learners. So you might have an advisor, you might have a mentor, and those are very different roles than what you would expect to see and the type of relationship that you'd be having with a coach. And so you can see that a coach would be helping the learner to really be coming at it from more of a strengths-based coaching type of model, in which you would ask the learner to be envisioning their future, wanting to focus on some things like building that relationship, but then looking at some of the different types of other structural or logistics, right? So in terms of meeting management, who's going to be responsible for setting up the meetings and having the follow-up meetings and the frequency and those types of things. And oftentimes you see this as being a little bit more of a learner-driven and based on their individual needs, interests, desires, as well as what their agendas might be and the timeline for being able to or needing to be working towards those goals together. Whereas oftentimes when you see advising sessions or mentors, there might be things that are a little bit more quarterly check-ins or once a semester check-in or things like that. Oftentimes, again, you will see different types of models that might be used, such as appreciative inquiry or looking at, again, motivational interviewing, WHOOP or iSmart. So iSmart is just an adaptation of the SMART goal setting that we had talked about before, in which they are incorporating the I for something that is either individual or what has been identified by the individual as being important. So you can see some examples here of some language around that. But again, there are a variety of different types of things that might be focused on throughout coaching. When we look at coaching in health professions education, there are some coaching programs and there are some coaching models that will address many of these things. So looking at like the adaptive learner type of model in which you're helping them to develop self-regulated learning skills, setting goals related to their academic performance, as well as things like exploring careers, being able to further develop their own well-being and resilience, emotional regulation, leadership development, mindfulness. So there are some programs, again, that would incorporate all of these and others that might emphasize one or two more explicitly. So I will take a second to ask just for you to reflect on some of the ways that maybe you might have coaches or have used coaches or are currently utilizing coaches in their own experience with learners, and the ways, the roles that they play and the types of things that they cover, right? Because again, it doesn't necessarily have to all be included within these different areas. And some of it can be based a little bit more on identified individual needs or potentially program needs as well. So before we continue in that discussion, it's not written out here on the, but if people have had experiences with that, please do feel free to add some things in the chat box. Because again, knowing that this is more of a growing field within the academic areas, I know that people might have varying levels of experience with it. I know at my prior institution, we actually had gone from very deliberately transitioning from having society advisors for our students to moving into a coaching model. And in working from that transition, there were some faculty development that we needed to do to help our faculty better understand what the difference was between advising and coaching. And we also had some people who had a little bit of some resistance to that language. And so sometimes not feeling as though coaching was as prestigious or as important of a role as what they had perceived or thought advisors to be. So having a lot of discussions and conversations around that was very, very eye-opening. But if people have had their own experiences, would love to hear what that has looked like for you. And I know that here at the Jacobs School, we are working towards launching a coaching program for our medical students that will start in the upcoming academic year. And some people have informal coaches that might not be a part of a formal program in that way, or they might, look to that on their own for their own personal development. I know several colleagues that I have who have worked with leadership coaches that have found that to be incredibly helpful in their own personal and professional development and career paths. So as we continue to think about coaching and some of the unique sets of skills and activities that you might be focusing on in those areas, we want to just, again, draw the distinction between assessment and evaluation. And I know that was something that was brought up earlier in the session, but just want to, again, focus on the fact that when we talk about evaluation is the process by which the teacher assesses a learner's knowledge, skills, or attitudes based on criteria related to educational goals or objectives. We oftentimes conflate or use these terms interchangeably, but in what we're thinking about with assessment is a little bit different than evaluation. So we want to make sure that we all understand that. And one of the things that we often will find is that throughout the course of developing and providing things like written evaluations over the course of the years and within various areas of disciplines or domains or specialties, there have been some changing calibration of what some of the language means and how we are evaluating learners and what that performance looks like. So when you hear things like excellent student or pleasure to work with or a good knowledge base or a solid trainee, or that someone performed above expectations or functioning at the expected level, what are your initial thoughts and reactions to some of that language? Do those have meaningful connotations associated with that? Can you think about how you would differentiate an excellent student from your solid student or your solid trainee? And how would you describe that to someone else? Some of the problems that we often have is that, again, we know it when we see it, but we sometimes struggle with that language. And as different programs and as different looking at different expectations for acceptance into residency programs or fellowships and so forth, sometimes this language loses some of its meaning. And when you actually see that a student is a pleasure to work with, that sometimes can be hidden code for some of the other things that might be going on in terms of interpersonal relationships or performance issues or things like that. And so every discipline, specialty, or different types of domains often have some of their hidden meaning or hidden culture as it relates to some of the language that is used within written evaluations. And what they have found in some of the more recent literature around this area is that it is not just what is picked up on among the faculty members and evaluators themselves, but the trainees, the students, the residents, they all usually have an understanding and their own perspective into what that means and what they're looking for. And again, talking a lot with one another about some of those things that we consider part of the hidden curriculum. And so it becomes even more important that when we as educators are writing written comments or creating those written evaluations, yes, similar to things that you all are putting in the chat, that we are able to provide specific examples. And many of these things are things that you all brought up and mentioned and included in the discussion around feedback, or at what makes for good feedback. So using that descriptive language, being non-judgmental, focusing on behaviors that can change. So those were some of the things that I believe Keaton had brought up in some of your comments as well when we came back from the one discussion. And again, the more that you can specifically tie that back to what the rotation learning objectives were, what the expectations were, and where they were in relationship to that. And then again, offering some suggestions for improvement that could include things that you want them to continue doing and some things that they could be working on in the future as well. So when you are taking the time to give that written feedback or putting something in writing, it allows you as an educator some more time to formulate it, be very specific and intentional about the language. It can be something that can be revisited by both the learner and potentially others who might be helping to support their improvement. And it can also be better organized. And sometimes it's a little bit easier to track over time. So even if you are giving mostly verbal or oral feedback, it can be helpful to be taking the time to jot some of those notes down and have that in writing so that you can, again, look at what that progression might look like over the course of your work together or the course of whatever that fellowship or experience might be. Some disadvantages is if it's not in the written, so there can sometimes be a lack of feedback, or I'm sorry, not feedback, follow-up. Some of that loss of interpersonal connection and relationship. So a lot of times what I'll do with learners, especially if I'm working with them in an elective type of situation, is to share with them what the feedback will be in a conversation. We will look at it together before I actually submit it in their final written part of the evaluation, because sometimes that tone can get lost. And again, we can, as readers, sometimes key in on some of the areas that resonate more with us or that we feel more accepting in the moment to be considering and to taking into account related to how we thought we might have done in that particular experience. The other disadvantage or advantage is that it is oftentimes read by many others. So ensuring that it has the right information to be able to interpret it and its meaning is crucial as well. So I'm sure many of you have had different types of feedback that you've been asked to provide in written comments, whether that is related to specific forms or some more general comments about a learner or an employee's performance. So we thought we'd share with you this example from a form that was from a graduate program. And in the graduate program, some of the criteria that the faculty member was expected to provide written comments on for the students in that rotation or within their lab setting were around critical thinking, background knowledge, and their scientific writing and presentation skills. So what we'd like to do is to have a little bit of your input through a poll. So as you look at that first written comment for critical thinking, and it had the student's name before, but that's been removed. The student has really taken ownership of the project in the last year. How useful do you think this comment is for the learner? And we're going to use a 1, not very useful, to 5 being extremely useful. And if you feel comfortable unmuting to share some of your initial comments, reactions, or rationale for your rating, because I see some interesting, we have some 1, and we have a 2, we have a 3, a couple 4s here. Again, if people are comfortable unmuting or putting some comments in the chat, happy to have your comments around why you thought that.
Hi, this is Kian. Yeah, so I think I couldn't vote, but it appeared and then it closed. But I would say that this is quite vague and ambiguous of a comment. I mean, I don't know how big these chat boxes are supposed to be, but surely identifying a growing concept, something that they're growing in ownership or leadership. You know, what does that word really mean to an individual? I think it's a very general term to use.
Agree. And I think that that can, as you're saying, mean different things to different learners, as well as to if it was another person, because the expectations for what ownership in that setting looks like might very much vary from individual to individual and project to project, right? So
right. I mean, I have ownership to my car, but I live out of my car. You know, somebody else doesn't live out of their car. You know, I'm just giving an example. You know, how does it look? You know, so that's an idea.
And I also, if you're looking back at critical thinking, it's asking about critical thinking.
Exactly. Yes.
And is taking ownership, is that really critical thinking? How do you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that if you look then at the EG that's included there, understands the goals of the research project in the context of the fields of study, but still what it was that connection there. And I think that there are a few other items that were included here that might not have been clearly addressed within that commentary. So we will go to one last one. We'll go to the next one. So in terms of, oh, sorry, Kirsten, if you go, yes, we'll do the student continues to read the pertinent literature expansion beyond the most relevant literature and into other systems would be helpful in writing their lit review. And again, this is some commentary on their background knowledge. I would love to allow people to have one last chance to share your reactions and thoughts to that. And then we will wrap up our discussion around written evaluation, or I'm sorry, written comments and feedback. And thank you, Dr. Watson, for your comment as well about taking full ownership without critical thinking. That's a very good point. And as you look at this one, I think that this gets you a little bit more specific, right? Because we at least know here as a learner what a next step would look like, right? So that next would be to explore literature outside of the most things that I'm currently looking at, right? So I know I have some direction. Doesn't tell me exactly what I need to do in terms of specific papers to read, but as a learner, that gives me a little bit of some autonomy as well.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this. Like, if I was the learner and I want to know how to improve myself, I'd want like an example. Was it like my report on cardiovascular disease and I didn't consider like the kidneys, or was it I didn't look at the right journal? Like, what I would like some more specifics, I would think, as a learner.
Thank you. Oh, and thank you, Gregory. I appreciate your clarification there. Okay, so one of the things that we have then on the, I'll ask you, Christy, if you don't mind going to the next slide, is we have a brief form for you to take a few moments to reflect on some of the different concepts and topics that we discussed today, knowing that we've had a rather full last session that focused on assessment, evaluation, some ideas and approaches for working with our struggling learners, and some different models for both feedback and coaching that potentially you might be able to, or already incorporating within some of your work with your team members, your students, your learners, or those that you might be working with or work with in the future. So we'd love to hear a little bit more about what that will look like for you. So there's a quick form for you to fill out, and the QR code is there. And we can also include that in the follow-up email for those of you who might not be in a place right now where you're able to complete it, or maybe doing this from your phone, et cetera, just so that you'll be able to take some time to reflect on that and bring some of those pieces together. We are really grateful for your feedback and comments throughout the course of the semester and throughout the course of the series, as well as your engagement throughout the sessions. And we are looking forward to continuing the conversation. So if people have additional questions, things you want to learn more about, or your own experiences to share with us as examples, would love to continue that conversation. You have our email addresses and contact information. And if you don't, Catherine can also share that with you in the future as well. And so the important thing to remember about feedback, not just in medical education, but I think in life in general, is that it's necessary, it's valuable, and after a bit of practice and planning, it's not as difficult as one might think. And that comes from a lovely article about feedback by Dr. Jack Envy.
Thank you.
So thank you again.